Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay. Well, welcome. My name is Winston C. Thompson. I'm an associate professor of educational studies and philosophy by courtesy here at The Ohio State University. I'm also a member of the steering committee for the Center for Ethics and Human Values, and it's through that work that I'm also coordinating this year's COMPAS program. As many of you are aware, COMPAS, or Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society, is one of the central event series of the Center. It brings together a range of thoughtful voices to focus our collective attention on important matters of public concern. This year's theme, Education in Our Democracy, has provided ample opportunities to consider the past, the present, and the future of our society through the prism of education as an often contested pathway to participation in that abiding project. Today's colloquium, What Should Civic Education Become in the 21st Century, picks up on this thread. It asserts that many of the practices of citizenship require a degree of skill and preparation such that the value of civic education cannot be overstated as a core component of a successful democracy. But how should societies understand the complexities of civic education in our current age? How should civic education respond to growing calls for justice as voiced through emergent social movements? Amidst rising patterns of immigration and globalized loyalties, can traditional approaches to civic education satisfy the needs of our democracies? Today, we're going to be joined by two exciting speakers as we consider civic education in the 21st century. Before I introduce them, let me just say a few words about our format during this event. After hearing from each of our speakers, we'll transition into something of a conversation, which I'll moderate, conversation between them and myself. We'll be talking about themes of their work and of their perspectives. And after this, we'll transition to questions from you, our guests. And I see in front of me here some wonderful familiar faces, some new faces, and some folks from the Graduate Student Conference on Philosophy of Education. So I want to issue a warm welcome to that community as well. If you're here in person, I want to ask that you cue at the microphone right over here. Aaron, could you point to the microphone for those? Yeah, thanks very much. That's the spot for questions in the room. And that microphone will allow us to hear you well. So I recognize that some of you might think, well, I've got a commanding voice. I don't need to stand at the microphone. Please stand at the microphone. If you're watching from elsewhere on the Zoom stream, welcome. And I would ask that you use the Q&A feature there on your screen. For those of you tuning in virtually and remotely, feel completely invited to jot your question down there as soon as it arises in your mind. We'll be able to sort of take a look at those questions and bring them forward here in this context. On that note, I should say that Aaron Yarmel, the Associate Director of the Center, will be the person doing that work of bringing questions forward. So if you're here in the room and you see Aaron approaching the microphone, it is for that purpose. Please allow him to speak. Thank you. Okay, so without further delay, let me introduce our speakers. Our first speaker this morning is going to be Angela M. Banks. Professor Banks is an immigration and citizenship expert whose research focuses on membership and belonging in democratic societies. Her scholarship can be found in leading American law review journals such as the Emory Law Journal, the William and Mary Law Review, and the Brooklyn Law Review. She is the author of Civic Education in the Age of Mass Migration, Implications for Theory and Practice. And I believe much of her remarks today are going to be coming from that work. Prior to joining the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law faculty at Arizona State University, Professor Banks was a professor of law at William and Mary School of Law. And she's also served as the Reginald F. Lewis Fellow for Law Teaching at Harvard Law School, as a legal advisor to Judge Gabriel Kirk McDonald at the Iran-United States Claims Tribunal, as an associate of Wilmer Cutler and Pickering in Washington, D.C., now known as Wilmer Hale, and as a law clerk for for Judge Carlos F. Lucero of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. She holds degrees from Spelman College, Oxford University, and Harvard Law School, where she served as an editor of the Harvard Law Review and the Harvard International Law Journal. We're also joined this morning by Peter Levine. Professor Levine is the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and Lincoln Filene Professor of Citizenship and Public Affairs in Tufts University's Jonathan Tisch College of Civic Life. Trained as a moral and political philosopher, Levine has spent most of his career conducting applied empirical research and organizing professional efforts related to civic life in the United States, including sustained work on civic education, voting rights, public deliberation, social movements, and the measurement of civic engagement. Levine holds degrees from both Yale and Oxford universities. Before his current role, he worked for Common Cause, the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy at the University of Maryland, and the National Commission for Civic Renewal, in addition to helping to found and then lead CIRCLE, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. Levine is the author or editor of 11 books. I'm not going to list them all, but I will say that these books include We Are the Ones We've Been Waiting For, The Promise of Civic Renewal in America, and What Should We Do? A Theory of Civic Life, from which I believe he'll be drawing today. Please join me in welcoming our guests. And now we'll first hear from Professor Banks.
Well, good morning, everyone. Well, afternoon. I'm still thinking about Phoenix time. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on those of you who might be zooming in. It's a real pleasure to be with you all today. I want to start by thanking Winston for inviting me to participate in this wonderful event today and for that lovely introduction. Maybe I'll send the link to my parents so they can hear it. I also want to thank Kate and Aaron for really helping out with the logistics of ensuring that we would all get here and that things would move as smoothly as they are. So let me start by talking about the context in which my work is thinking about civic education. In 1990, 5.3 million school-age children had at least one foreign-born parent, and that number soared to 12.4 million in 2018. Additionally, recent data estimates that 5.3 million youth are unauthorized migrants or live with a parent with at least one parent with that immigration status. There are approximately 1 million school children who are unauthorized migrants themselves. And these demographic changes have important implications for the way that civic education is conceptualized in K-12 schools. Now, civic education generally seeks to prepare individuals to be responsible participants in a democratic society. And this book project grew out of a realization that civic education and citizenship education in K-12 schools overwhelmingly use citizenship as the exclusive framework for national membership. In other words, who are the members of a democratic society? Citizens. Now, these lessons are generally taught through the lens of citizenship by focusing on what good citizenship is and what good citizens do, things like voting or running for office. Now, this approach to participation in democratic society fails to identify the wide range of individuals residing within a democratic society who participate in economic, political, and social life who lack citizenship status. These individuals' forms of participation and the various connections they have to communities within the United States or any democratic society are not always visible within civic education. Consequently, the potential membership and membership activities of non-citizens are inadequately addressed. Similarly, the boundaries of citizenship are insufficiently examined within civic education. So when we think about the boundaries of citizenship, I'm thinking about things like the line between citizen and non-citizen, the criteria for citizenship, the goals achieved by drawing lines where they are, and the need for a line in the first place. These types of questions are an important part of any inquiry into determining how to be a responsible participant in a democratic society. Yet these questions are generally absent within civic education, at least traditional civic education. And so the book project that you saw the sort of early slide on argues for a broader conception of national membership within civic education, one that includes long-term residents, regardless of their immigration status or their citizenship status. And to facilitate this broader approach to membership, the book calls for civic education to seriously engage with the issue of citizenship boundaries. So traditional civic education focuses on citizenship as an expression of membership within the democratic society, presents three, I think, challenges that limit the effectiveness of preparing individuals to be responsible participants within a democratic society. First, it does not adequately address citizenship status and immigration status and the meaningful impact such statuses have on one's ability to participate within society. So I want to highlight four significant ways that status, both immigration status and citizenship status, shape an individual's participation within the United States. So first, these statuses shape one's ability to enter and actually reside in the United States. U.S. citizens are the only individuals that have an unqualified right to enter and reside or remain in the United States. All non-citizens' ability to do so is shaped by federal law. Only certain categories of non-citizens are granted permission to enter the United States, and all non-citizens, regardless of their immigration status, can be deported if they fall within one of the statutorily enumerated deportation grounds within federal law. And that's something people often don't realize. They think that, well, they've lived here for a really long time, they can't be deported. But it's about citizenship status, it's not about length of time in the country. Second, access to education is shaped by citizenship and immigration status. Now, access to K-12 public schools is the same for citizens and non-citizens alike, based on the 1982 Supreme Court decision Plyler v. Doe, which held that school children who were unauthorized migrants could not be denied a free public school K-12 education. Yet access to post-secondary education is more complicated. So as of January of this year, Alabama and South Carolina prohibit individuals who are unauthorized migrants from attending any public post-secondary institution. And 3 additional states prohibit these individuals from paying in-state tuition. It's Georgia, Indiana, and Missouri. However, in Indiana, DACA recipients may have access to in-state tuition at specific institutions based on the rules of that institution. Now, third, access to employment is also shaped by citizenship and immigration status. There are no jobs that citizens are prohibited from holding in the United States based on citizenship or immigration status, but non-citizens' access to employment can vary based on their immigration status. So let me just take a quick moment to give you some terms of art in immigration law. We have the distinction between immigrants and non-immigrants. Immigrants, which you are probably more familiar with the term green card holder or lawful permanent resident, these are individuals who are granted permission to reside in the United States indefinitely unless they run afoul of one of the deportation grounds. And the main categories for obtaining LPR, lawful permanent resident or LPR status is through family categories or employment categories. And there's certain types of employment that generally make you eligible to get this green card. On the other hand, we have non-immigrants, and non-immigrants are admitted to the United States for a very specific purpose for a specified period of time. So for example, a classic example that I like to give in the university context is individuals on a student visa. They are granted permission to enter into the United States to pursue a specific course of study, and they are given a certain amount of time in order to complete that course of study. If they remain beyond the period of time that they were authorized to enter, then they become unauthorized because their visa has expired, essentially. So non-citizens with immigrant status or sort of LPR status are authorized to work in the United States and have few limitations on the types of employment they can have. We have one Supreme Court decision from 1973 that does say states can prohibit immigrants from having jobs that, quote, go to the heart of representative government. And over the years, states have used that to include state troopers, peace officers, or school teachers, but that generally is not a limitation that exists in most states today. Now, non-citizens with non-immigrant status are admitted for employment, who are admitted for employment purposes, are only authorized to work in the sector and for the employer that they were granted permission to enter for. So for example, H-1B worker who got a visa to work for Google, cannot easily switch and get a job with Microsoft. There has to be an application to apply to see if they can move that visa over to Microsoft. Now, unauthorized migrants are not authorized to work in the United States, which gives rise to precarious situations in which they are vulnerable to poor working conditions, low wages, wage theft, and inconsistent hours. Now, finally, opportunities for political participation are also shaped by citizenship and immigration status. Only citizens are legally allowed to vote in state and federal elections and to run for office in those elections. Lawful permanent residents can volunteer with political campaigns, make financial contributions, and participate in non-election related political activities. Non-immigrants and unauthorized migrants are similarly able to volunteer and participate in non-election related political activities, but they cannot make financial contributions to political campaigns. So despite these limitations, unauthorized migrants have been very politically active by mobilizing and lobbying for immigration reforms that would expand the rights and opportunities of unauthorized migrants in the United States. But again, through methods and challenges that aren't related to financial support of political candidates. Now, these are critical ways in which citizenship and immigration status matter. They're not always addressed within traditional civic education, which limits the ability to effectively examine responsible participation within a democratic society. Now, second, traditional civic education does not conceptualize non-citizens as members of the polity. The default approach of conceptualizing members as citizens leads to the conclusion that non-citizens are not members of the polity. This, however, occurs without an in-depth exploration of membership criteria, the purpose of such criteria, how they have changed over time, and how the criteria are connected to the purpose of membership. And this brings us to the final challenge within traditional civic education, and that is a failure to examine the boundaries of citizenship and explore the legitimacy of existing boundaries. If these challenges are not addressed, I see several problems that will arise and/or persist. First, classrooms are likely to become or remain alienating to students who are unauthorized migrants and students from mixed status families. So mixed status families are families in which individuals have different immigration and citizenship status. For example, you could have parents and an older sibling who are unauthorized migrants, and you could have younger siblings who are US citizens because they were born in the United States. As a citizenship as membership approach to civic education highlights a tension between these students' lived experience as de facto members of American society, evidenced by their community connections and contributions to social, economic, and political life, and the lack of formal membership status that exists. Failing to acknowledge this tension can result in alienation. And second, for citizen students and non-citizen students with lawful immigration status, the citizenship as membership approach obscures unauthorized migrants' significant connections to their local, state, and national communities and their sense of connection and belonging. Interrogating the boundaries of citizenship and offering opportunities to rethink membership allows a wider range of activities to be recognized and examined as relevant for responsible participation within a democratic society. And finally, the citizenship as membership approach presents the current membership boundaries as just and unworthy of critique. Little to no attention is placed on the criteria for citizenship, the goals achieved by drawing the lines where they are, or the need for a line in the first place. Now, as an immigration legal scholar, I'm acutely aware that ignoring the boundaries of citizenship suggests that the boundaries reflect reasoned and justifiable line drawing. But again, this is assumed. So the book project is my effort to highlight this issue for K-12 teachers and teacher educators and to provide tools to explore citizenship boundaries. Now, I begin the exploration of citizenship boundaries by noting that national membership in democratic societies like the United States is often rooted in three principles: popular sovereignty, participation, and the jus nexi principle. Popular sovereignty refers to the idea that the power of the state derives from the people who are governed, which gives rise to the democratic principle of inclusion. The participation principle helps us determine whose basic or fundamental interests are directly affected by state law and policy. Now, an important aspect of unauthorized migrants' connections to the United States is their economic activity within the labor market. Well, this type of participation is not and should not be a prerequisite for formal membership within a society. When it does exist due to the economic model that's been adopted by the state, it would be unjust to ignore it. And so, as outlined in Chapter 2 of the book, the United States' economic prosperity has depended on low-wage or no-wage foreign workers since the beginning of its founding. And so this is just something to keep in mind when we think about participation. Now, the Jus Nexi principle bases national membership on an individual's genuine connections to the society. Now, legal scholar Ayelet Shachar developed this principle to recognize the various ways that individuals are deeply embedded within American communities. And since the founding of the United States of America, citizenship laws have incompletely implemented these principles. Each of these principles are present in U.S. law governing citizenship. However, at various points in U.S. history, racial hierarchy, patriarchy, and class hierarchy have prevailed over popular sovereignty, participation, and jus nexi. So, for example, between 1790 and 1952, there were racial requirements for naturalization. Those requirements were expanded in 1870 to include those of African nativity or African descent. They were expanded again in 1942 with the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that removed the prohibition against Chinese nationals naturalizing, but it wasn't until 1952 that we got rid of all racial requirements for naturalization. Now, we think about patriarchy. Between 1907 and 1931, American women were stripped of their U.S. citizenship if they married a non-citizen. So this first began in 1907 based on a legal concept or legal doctrine called coverture, which was the idea that married women did not have a legal identity separate and apart from their husbands. And so the concern was that their interest in loyalty would follow that of their husband. And so if they were married to a non-citizen, their loyalty would attach to the nationality of their husband as opposed to what the state that they were born in. The Cable Act of 1922 amended the 1907 law such that American women retained their U.S. citizenship if they married a non-citizen who was, quote, eligible for citizenship. Now, this takes us back to the racial requirements for naturalization because at that time, only white immigrants and immigrants of African nativity or descent were eligible for naturalization. So this meant, for example, if a U.S. citizen married a non-citizen who was Asian, they lost their U.S. citizenship until 1931. Now, if we think about class hierarchy, U.S. Immigration law has historically made it more difficult for quote-unquote unskilled foreign workers to gain admission to the United States. And the reason I say quote-unquote unskilled is because when we think a lot of the work that those individuals do, it does take quite a bit of skill. It's just a different skill set than we typically think of as being notably skilled in American society. But we see this, it's very difficult for those workers to get access to the United States. So it was first evident in the Chinese Exclusion Act that prohibited the entry of Chinese laborers. That's something people don't often realize. It wasn't a prohibition on all Chinese nationals. It was just for Chinese laborers. And then the Alien Contract Law, Labor Law of 1885 prohibited the entry of unskilled foreign workers altogether. So today, unskilled foreign workers' access to the United States as lawful permanent residents is extremely limited. We have a very small category of visas available to those individuals, and the waiting period for those visas is incredibly long, often 10, 12 years. So while racial hierarchy and patriarchy are no longer explicit aspects of U.S. citizenship law, class hierarchy issues remain as a result of the immigrant labor paradox. And so immigrant workers have been critical to the economic growth and development of American society, yet these workers have often been perceived as a threat to American society. And that threat has been based on ideas about language acquisition, criminality, religion, et cetera. And so the desirability of these foreign workers, however, has been based on their willingness to work for wages and in conditions that enable employers to maximize their profits. Now, despite these benefits to specific industries, U.S. labor interest, historically and less so today, and I'm happy to talk about that during the Q&A, and other constituencies have viewed them as a threat. And these concerns around threat tend to, again, as I mentioned, focus on this idea that there's some sort of tension with traditional U.S. values and norms. So immigration and citizenship law has responded to this paradox by granting employers access to their desired workers, but doing so in a way that requires the workers to remain on the peripheral of American society without a pathway to formal membership status. And by that I mean citizenship status or lawful immigration status. And so the primary strategies for achieving this equilibrium are temporary worker programs and citizenship eligibility requirements. And I'm just happy to discuss how these strategies operate in more detail during the Q&A. So once one understands that citizenship boundaries exist and that they have not always been just, it is important to provide students with the opportunity to explore our current citizenship boundaries. And in the book, I offer teachers and teacher educators examples of how to incorporate exploration of citizenship and membership boundaries into classrooms. So for example, one entry point is narratives within the immigrant rights movement. So for example, dreamers are known as these sort of young individuals who were born not in the United States, but have been here for the majority of their life. They are excelling academically, active in their community, and it seems like they are on their way to living the American dream, and the only thing getting in their way is their immigration status. However, as immigrant youth became more active in the immigrant rights movement, they began to recognize that this narrative reinforced the idea that there were good immigrants who were deserving of things and bad immigrants who were not deserving, and that it perhaps reinforced the idea that their parents were undeserving immigrants. And so they began to push back on this narrative, talking about their parents were the original dreamers and some other examples that I'm happy to provide in the Q&A. And so one of the things that I offer in the book is an exercise for students to think about what are the narratives that are being used to advance access to citizenship status for unauthorized migrants. And so these are some of the questions, asking the students to identify two different narratives that exist through particular sources, and then asking them to think about how is membership conceptualized in this narrative? Does the narrative build on or challenge mainstream conceptions of membership, et cetera? So you can see the questions there. So this exercise and others explore the boundaries of citizenship, and they raise questions about the role of race, gender, and class in thinking about membership in American society. And I do acknowledge in the book and have quite a bit of discussion about how this can be really challenging for students and teachers alike. And one of the concepts that's important for teachers who are engaging in this work is to understand motivated cognition. And so there's some helpful information from psychologists about what that is, how it operates, and just providing some resources in the book for teachers to be aware of this and as a tool to help them deal with these difficult conversations that can exist. So in conclusion, let me say that classrooms throughout American society are becoming more diverse along citizenship lines. Not only are an increasing number of non-citizen students attending primary and secondary school, but a significant number of those students are unauthorized migrants themselves or have family members who are. And this form of diversity within classrooms increases the likelihood that relying on citizenship as a primary tool within democratic societies could undermine cohesion. And I've talked about why it can do so both on behalf of unauthorized migrant students, but also for citizen and lawfully present students. And so civic educators can address these challenges by offering opportunities for students to critically examine the boundaries of citizenship and think more creatively about alternative membership regimes. So thank you for your time this morning, and I look forward to the discussion that we're going to have. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here, especially with two colleagues whose work I deeply admire. And I think you'll find really interesting complementarities and kind of resonances between our talks. I was just processing that. In fact, I'd rather just sit here and process that for a while, but I'm supposed to actually present, so I will. This presentation is based on a new book, 2022 book, though I have tried to create the presentation to address Professor Thompson's question for us. So the title of the book is 4 words. Well, there's a subtitle, A Theory of Civic Life, but the title is 4 words. And in a sense, the argument of the book is that this is the question, the civic question. Actually, at the beginning of the book, I say it's the citizen's question, and we should come back to that. I agree with your critique, Professor Banks. And so in my own life, I've actually been drifting away from using the word citizen just because it conveys to people, although I don't think it has to convey to people, but it does convey to people the idea that it's legal membership in a nation state. And I don't want it to mean that. So this is the question. This is a much more general question. It's the question for people who are part of any kind of group, which I think is a kind of citizenship at any scale. But the argument is that this is the question, and that it is attended to in our culture, in academia, in research, in teaching, but just in our culture, that it drops out, and that it's the central question for civic education, that we should learn to ask it. So it's only 4 words. I'm going to take a few minutes on each of them because I take the sentence pretty seriously, as you can find out. So it ends with the word do for 2 reasons. One is that I think we have to act. We have to make the world better. Every once in a while, sometimes the right thing to do is not to act, not for example, for me not to act, but that's a form of action too. So one reason that we need to think about doing is because we need to do. But the other reason is that it's a form of challenge or intellectual discipline to ask, what should we do? And not to ask only, what do I think about this? Or, what's my opinion of it? Or how do I evaluate something? But what should we do? Is actually often a very hard question. And that's a good thing, because we need to ask that hard question as students, but as human beings through our whole lives. The question is we, and I really want to emphasize that, because I think the we tends to slip away. So one direction it slips away is to not talk anymore about an actual concrete we that we're part of, like the people in this room, but instead essentially to let the question become, what should they do? And you see this in community settings. You see this with regular people, that the question doesn't become, what should we do? And so the meeting doesn't conclude with any action. It concludes with a kind of opinion forming. The other direction it can slide away into is simply the I. So what I should do is an important question, and it's important for each of you, for what you should do individually. Of course, it's a way of putting the basic question of ethics, what should I do? But let me put the limits of the question of the I question bluntly. I am stupid and I am weak. So I am stupid in the sense that I have a very limited cognitive capacity, very little empathy, very little understanding of the rest of the world's needs and their situations. And so I'm by myself not going to make good decisions. And also I'm weak. I can't accomplish much. So I need to be in a we where other people can hold me accountable and shape my thinking and where we can move forward together. And again, to sort of connect our talks, the we doesn't have to be the nation state, although that is one form. The question is should. I think in a forum like this one, where there's a lot of philosophers and philosophy-curious people, this doesn't require as much justification as it sometimes does. But we're in what I would call a positivist culture, in which a lot of people think should is just a matter of opinion, and people have different opinions, and that's all that could be said. It's not a truth claim. But that kind of thinking slips away in a real group that is seriously concerned about something. They will not express kind of moral relativism. What they will do is say, it's absolutely unjust that this is going on in our schools, and they mean it. And the problem is, though, that we disagree. So we have to, and we always will, so we have to figure out how to reason together so that we can come to a better sense of what we should do. And the should involves both our ends, what should our goals be, and our means, what's a legitimate or even a praiseworthy means to use towards our ends. And the final word is what, which is in a way a little bit of an excuse, but it's my hook for saying facts. So facts, the what does matter. You want to understand what to do about, well, for example, you want to understand what to do about citizenship. You need Professor Banks to tell you about the actual laws and the statistics. Otherwise, you're going to be very foolish in your decision. So we are obliged to figure out what's going on. So that's the question. Now, there's a very good, very legitimate, very important rebuttal to that question, which is, in an unjust world, very often the people who should be asking what should we do, I would say normally, the people who should be asking what we should do don't. And the people who are forced into a position of having to ask what should we do are the ones who shouldn't have to, because at least they're not morally responsible for the problem. They didn't cause it. At worst, they may be actually oppressed, under oppression. And so essentially, why should they have to ask the question? Well, and the answer is they shouldn't have to. And also, I'm not going to ask anybody to ask the question if they don't think they want to or they're not in a position to. But in an unjust world, the people who should ask the question won't. And so what ends up happening is the people who are oppressed or otherwise, or even just sort of average people, are going to end up having to be the ones to ask the question. And so what we need to do is learn how to ask it well. Very often what they're going to decide to do is to try to compel someone else to change their behavior. They're going to have a target. They're going to want somebody else to change. But that's a form of doing. And you can do that effectively or ineffectively. You can say you guys should change, but in a way that they don't even hear, or you can say you guys should change, and if you don't, this is what's going to happen to you, and organize, and you'll be more effective. The question, what should we do, then gets nested in a bigger agenda. So it isn't separable from who am I and what groups do I belong to. It isn't separable. They are interconnected, and it's not even really clear that logically one comes first. That I think they're logically interconnected. And both the who am I and the which groups do I belong to questions are hard and often subtle and ambiguous. For example, it can be not clear which groups I belong to. On one hand, I might have some kind of membership in a group but not be sure that anybody else cares about me or listens to me or likes me, in which case I'm not sure I'm part of the group. On the other hand, I might not acknowledge that I'm part of a group, that I am part of, whether I like it or not. So, and likewise, I think we all realize that who am I is a hard question, a lifetime question. But let's assume, and we're only assuming it so that we can continue the conversation. In reality, we can't just assume this. But let's assume that we have a sort of provisional we. And I sort of know who I am at this moment, and I sort of know what group this is, and I know I'm sort of part of it, and we have to decide what should we do. Then I'm going to claim that there are three big generic questions that are sort of process questions that we all have to learn to ask. And you're going to say, where on this page are the things I care about, whether it's climate change or racial justice or taxes are too high or whatever you care about. And they're not going to be here, but that's because these are the kind of process questions, the relatively abstract questions that are actually going to apply to any issue by virtue of the fact that you're a group. So the first question is, how do you actually have a group that functions at all, that sustains itself? Because it's got a bunch of individuals who have to be sort of voluntarily bought in, even if they're rewarded, which is a good idea often, for their participation. You still have to figure that out. So how do you get everybody here at noon in the same time and place? This is a nice group, by the way. But how do we, make a functioning group, and how do we get people to come back, and how do you recruit new people? And there's a whole art and science to that, the art of association, as de Tocqueville would say. And there's much to be said about it, but it's going to come down in part to learning the art of creating the right rules and norms that get people to participate, crafting those so that they work, and building trust, enough trust in the group that it can function. Second issue is people are going to disagree about means and ends, about which is right and good. And they're going to do so more if the group is diverse and diversity is good. So they should disagree. But we've got to disagree in a way that is productive. Doesn't necessarily have to yield consensus, but it's productive. And that means we have to learn, I think, two basic things. One is the whole question of how to talk and listen well, which is partly an ethical question of who should you, what opinions and views should you take seriously and respect, and which ones are out of bounds, and those kinds of questions. But also a question of design, of institutional design. So a newspaper is a design for conversation. Twitter is a space for conversation. This series is a space for conversation. They all have designs to them. They are all good and bad. Not to put them on par, because this is better than Twitter. But they all need design. And the third question is back to, what if the people who should be changing their behavior are not even in the conversation because they don't care? So what if there's another group that is not including us? And this is where we have to learn to be effectively advocates. And I think the places to learn from are the whole world of social movements, how to make one work and how to make it good, because some social movements are bad. And I lean heavily on nonviolence and nonviolent theory, not because I'm actually a pacifist, so I actually think that violence is morally appropriate and effective in some circumstances, but partly because I think there's a tremendous amount to be learned from the tradition of nonviolent. Nonviolence is not just a privation. It's not just saying you can't use violence, do whatever else you want. It's a robust theory of change. And also because in many contexts, that's the only real option. because, for example, the United States government has a very powerful army. And so if you really think you're going to beat that army, I have my doubts. So nonviolence is a standard method in many contexts. In case you're interested, that's a very homemade website that I did myself, so terrible design and everything, but it does have the same questions, elaborate a little more, and then you could click through for what I'm beginning to do is collect as many materials as I can from other people's work, as well as a bit from my own, to help you pursue them. And this is a moment for me to say, this is a lifelong learning agenda. So it is an answer to the question of this forum, because I think this is what students should be learning K-12, but it's also, we're never going to stop learning it till the day we die. These are hard questions. And it's also a research agenda. So each of these questions is studied, but needs to be studied, and sometimes more than some of them are overlooked. I'm just going to take a few minutes to walk you through a little bit more. So the method of the book it's a political theory book. So what I'm really doing is drawing on traditions of thinking, which are kind of coherent. So there's some people who I can name, and they have advocated views, but they've also been in dialogue with critics, and they have informed and been informed by practice. So there are three, and each of them relates to one of these basic questions. So the first tradition, the question is, how do we coordinate? So think of, those are Tufts University women's crew, and they're carrying a boat at the same time. It's an effective moment of coordination. It's quiet, by the way, so there's no talk here. I mean, we'll come back to that. But how do you coordinate? And the hero of the book here is the late Eleanor Ostrom, who was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics and an Indiana University professor. And her whole life was spent trying to figure out how you can coordinate. The second question is, how do we disagree about values? Well, because we're going to. So then you think about talk. Then it's no longer quiet. Then even if it's written, there's going to be communication and there's going to be dissent. And the book really draws on the still going 90-plus-year-old German philosopher and sociologist Jürgen Habermas, and then a whole bunch of critics and people who think in ways inspired by him. So I'm showing my friend and inspiration, Danielle Allen, who is every time she writes about Habermas is actually critical of him, but I would say it's in the same ballpark. And then when you think about how do you exclude groups, think about powerful social movements taking to the streets. And the two theorists, and I treat them both as theorists, not as sort of noble individual human beings who spoke well, but as theorists, are Gandhi and King, Mohandas K. Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. This is my last two slides. I wanted to help you kind of, I guess, map the book a little bit in case you're interested in the book, but if you're not interested in the book, perfectly understandable. It might help you map the questions that I think people should ask. So at the top here are names for these three traditions. They're shorthand because in each case there are many other people we should read and think about than the highlighted names. And you could think about it this way. Each of them is primarily worried about a different problem. So for Lynn Ostrom and her colleagues, it's a failure to get something that we would all agree is a good thing, but we don't get there because we don't coordinate. So we don't carry the boat to the river to have the race, or we don't save the planet from climate change, even though that would be bad for everybody and nobody wants to burn up, but we don't coordinate our behavior. For Habermas, the problem is that the opinions that people have are bad, and for example, he was born under the Nazi dictatorship and even served in World War II at the end of it on the German side. But specifically that the ideas are bad because people have been brainwashed, manipulated, propagandized. That's what he's concerned about. And for Gandhi and King, and I can't read my own white thing on yellow, that's supposed to change. But it says, maybe somebody can help me, it says dehumanizing others, right? I should also be able to memorize this. So the problem here is that people don't treat other people as even belonging in the community. So the starting point would be typically for Ostrom that we know what we want, but we can't get it. For Habermas that we want, or some of us at least want bad things, or we at least might want bad things. And for Gandhi and King, it's that some people just don't even recognize other people's rights. So the typical examples that are going to occur for Ostrom, it's often going to be it's not always, but it's often going to be an environmental problem because those have that characteristic. For Habermas, it's going to be things like propaganda, corporate, state, other kinds of propaganda. And for these authors, it's going to be racial exclusion, right, and ethnic exclusion. Is that what I said? That's what I should say. Right. And so I just had written these two questions before. I know that Professor Thompson has other questions, which are good. I also think we should try to make some space for putting the two talks together because it's interesting to me. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you both so much. This was just wonderful. I know that my mind is full of many ideas that have been stimulated by hearing each of the talks individually and then beginning to think about them in some concert. Towards that goal, and I know that that's probably true for others as well, I'm looking out at these faces, seeing smiles and sort of furrowed brows as folks are thinking. But let me just get us started by talking about some of the connections here and asking a question that I think might get us closer to the heart of the question that motivates our time here together. Professor Banks, so much of your work here in the presentation and in the book begins with an expanded account of citizenship, membership, right? Who is it that we're thinking about here when we're thinking about these questions of civic education, right? So you're opening up and expanding the range of folks who fall into consideration here. Professor Levine, in your work, in asking this citizens question or the civic question, what should we do, right? It does many things, as you mentioned, but there, when we think about that we might recognize that, that question of who we are, how we are defined, right, may have us come to the realization that, in a civic space, some of us occupy different positions, right? So I'm just wondering about sort of taking both of these questions, both of these insights together, what that might mean for civic education. More pointedly, I guess my question is, if there are different we's, right, sort of in a population, does that imply that there ought to be different types of civic education for different communities, for the folks who don't have the legal status, for those who, are immigrants of various sorts, those, occupying particular or are holders of particular gendered, racialized identities, disability status? I'm just curious about your thoughts of regarding the potential for different curricula on civic education that speaks to the specifics of the we.
Sure. So starting off easy.
That's right.
So I think I'm thinking of this as how do we provide K-12 civic education that really does prepare students to participate in our society at large and in our world. And so in that sense, I don't want there to be sort of these people get this civic education and these people get that civic education, because my idea is that we're all going to be participating in this broader society together. But recognizing that how we understand, I think it's almost a more fundamental question of who is the we that we are thinking of when we're thinking about who's going to be participating in who is our society for?
Sure.
And in thinking about how do we understand the boundaries of who is the we for us? And I absolutely take your point that citizenship is often a term that's used in a lot of different contexts. Right. So for example, my son's in second grade and they talk about being good citizens at school. Sure. And I'm like, nobody has a legal status at the school. But then it's like, but I recognize as lawyers, we often focus on the legal status. And in many non-legal contexts, it's a universal term used to mean member. But I do think there are times when those two ideas get conflated in ways that are not appropriate. Because when we often think about the broader society at large, and some people are thinking, well, citizen just means member, and then they find out, a childhood friend is an unauthorized migrant and they can't understand why they can't stay here. And it's like, but you're a member of our society. Well, yeah, but they're a member in this sort of de facto sense, but not in a formal de jure sense that we might say in law. And so to me, in my mind, it's a more of that, how can we have a more inclusive understanding of the we to prepare people for our society and world participation?
Yeah.
Oh, I completely agree with that. I think it might be worth saying, so, a lot of the time spent in classrooms that's called civic education in the United States and in other countries that I know about really focuses on the nation state.
Yeah.
And so in a way, the question that they want to, that the authorities or decision makers have asked us to ask is, what is this country? How does it
Yes.
work?
Yeah.
If we're going to do that, and I suppose I would even say we should do some of
Yeah.
it because it's a good question, then you have to do it the way Professor Banks says, because we have because people are differently positioned regarding that citizenship. There's the question of immigrants, but there's also the question, certainly, of African Americans who, for whom the history doesn't, it can't be about. And so, I'm sure you have more specific and better ideas, but I'd love to talk about Frederick Douglass's What to the Slave of the 4th of July, because, for a lot of reasons, but partly because he addresses his white abolitionist audience as a they, and says, and the Constitution as theirs, not his, because it isn't his. And that's the kind of thing people should be talking about. So if we're going to do, if we're going to do a nation state curriculum, and I think we probably have to do some of it, we have to do it your way. But the other pieces, we shouldn't only be talking about the nation state, because we have so many different we's.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I would prefer to turn the emphasis backwards. To me, the question is, what should we do? And at a certain point in the curriculum, you do have to think about, okay, one of the we's that we're in is the nation state.
Yeah.
And one of the things we can do is, run for president.
Sure.
Yeah, but you can do an awful lot of other things, right? So how a bill becomes a law becomes a little piece. And maybe, the irony is that often the way state curricula and standards are written, they do actually put some sort of action in, but they put it literally comes after the exam at the end of the school year, and it gets lost. So I would be willing to have, the three branches of government come so late in the year that sometimes it gets lost.
Yeah.
If we could talk about the other stuff first.
Sure.
And I think that gets to your point, because
That's right,
people are in lots of different we's. Now, there is the very important question of sort of how do you have a kind of genuine equity when the world is diverse and unequal. So how do you have everybody somehow empowered to be part of the same conversation and yet respectful of their differences? That's a fundamental problem in education anyway. That applies to literature or anything.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm hearing in both of your comments something about the specificity of the education, right? I mean, so there is a way in which education perhaps any educational endeavor needs to be specific in thinking about the students, in the process there, right? So thinking about that audience and perhaps cultivating or curating a sense of the message for an audience. And in some of the comments that you've offered, I'm beginning to sort of imagine a picture of, well, maybe not concentric circles, sort of the nation and then sort of smaller communities and identity groups and so forth, because I could imagine that, as we all know, identities don't necessarily sort of overlap in ways that are going to be fully entailed in that sort of concentric circle picture. But I could imagine also sort of making a distinction perhaps between the types of education that occur in a school setting, a formal institution, right? Formal civic education, and then the informal education that happens, in smaller spaces, right? So, a woman talking to a young girl saying, look, here's some things that I think you might need to think about or know, right? A person of color speaking to another person of color saying, look, as your, father, mother, let me tell you some things about what you're likely to experience and the ways in which we might begin to answer that question, what should we do, depending on who we are in some meaningful ways. I guess that also makes me think, or sort of stimulates some of my thinking about something that you alluded to, Professor Levine, in noting, the K through 12 category, and Professor Banks, you also talked about K through 12 education, but also acknowledging that, higher education is a space within which we're also trying to navigate some of these issues of civic education. And I think that's an important sort of part of this puzzle to kind of spend a little time on, particularly here at a university with a motto like OSU's motto, right? Education for citizenship, or maybe education for membership, or education for civic engagement. I mean, there's a question perhaps that's that sort of rests just behind that motto. But I guess, there might be one way of thinking about everything that's occurring at this university as, preparing people for civic participation and being a good member. But I wonder if that doesn't sort of lose something of the distinctive character of civic education. I mean, is everything, right? What should we do, right? Is it, my statistics course? Is it my, English lit? Or is there something very particular that we ought to be focused on when we're thinking about the civic educational curriculum occurring in higher ed?
You want to start? Or?
No, you-
Well, so I actually think that the questions that Professor Levine pointed out at the end, sort of these, how do we coordinate, how do we disagree about values well, and how do we deal with exclusion, are some really important questions that, we have to grapple with as a democratic society. And I think, universities, I think about myself at a law school where, we're training lawyers, and often the civic aspects of the civic aspects of the role of lawyers in society is often not the lens through which law school is taught.
Right.
Now, I was at a previous institution that was the first law school in the country, not the oldest operating, which is where I'm an alum. But yeah, a little Civil War got in the way there. But they talked about citizen lawyers. And this idea that citizen lawyers were, the idea was that lawyers were to be, sort of not just, that they were civic actors, and that they had a role to play in the civic life of society. And so I think, what are the ways that we can help when educating students think about whatever discipline they might be studying? How do they think about these questions?
Yeah.
How do they think about the role that they will play in society through that discipline or through the different, one thing that I heard recently is that, we should stop asking kids what they want to be when they grow up and start asking them, what problems do you want to solve? And so I do think that there's a way in which we can think about education in sort of higher ed as around these questions that Professor Levine, offered us as a way of thinking about that.
Yeah, I really like the emphasis on the profession, because each of the professions has potentially a civic role and also potentially a destructive one. So that's a great way in. I mean, I guess one thing is we do want some kind of division of labor. We want civic education to be done in many different contexts, just as you said. And a public K-12 school has advantages. For example, it gets a lot of our people at a formative moment, and it brings people together to some extent, although there's tremendous residential segregation.
Sure.
But it also has limitations, and people who think that the school can really be actively involved in encouraging students to challenge the nation state, I think, are foolish, because it's a product, it's a part of the state. And I just don't think it works. I think you have to do that out of school. So then when you have this bigger picture of all the different venues, certainly higher education is one. I really like the emphasis on helping people to integrate civic things into their professional life. I mean, the great deficit of higher education is that it's also a tool of stratification, and it's only reaching about half of our people, and it's separating the more advantaged from the less. And so it can't be the only place.
Sure.
And that doesn't mean it isn't a really important place, and I'm happy that a lot of my life is spent on sort of that space. But I would also just say that I think one of our biggest deficits comparatively is our failure to provide robust civic learning opportunities for adults, either who have never gone to college or who are long past college. And that's not just an inevitability. Really quickly, I'll mention I've been doing these exchanges with Germans lately. And it's really interesting because the United States was in control of two countries in 1946, Germany and the United States, and we had two policy choices there. In the United States, we scaled up higher ed through the Truman Report, 1947 or 1948, which is framed in terms of democracy, although that partly means just anti-communism, and the democracy it's not cognizant, or at least it doesn't acknowledge things like racial injustice. But it is about democracy, and this solution that's proposed is to expand access to higher ed. In Germany, we actually created an adult higher education system, which still exists.
Yeah.
And we did that partly because we thought we had to re-educate a lot of former Nazis.
Sure.
But it still exists and it thrives. And when you look at the pros and cons, I worry about our deficits, which is that we just offer very little for anybody who's not in college and who's out of K-12.
Yeah.
Can I just respond to that? Because I think that's really important, because I think, so in legal circles right now, one of the things that there's a lot of conversation about is, sort of traditional civil rights advocacy has focused on getting to the Supreme Court and getting, the right Supreme Court decision. And in recent years, there's been a recognition that the court may not be the place to go. And so where else do you look for places to protect individual rights? And I think what you're highlighting is the importance of K-12 schools are one place, but not the only place, and perhaps not the most important place. And so what are the other places that we ought to be looking to recognize that this civic work is important to get done, and that they play a really important role? Because I think now we're, in legal circles looking at what are states and localities doing, and how can they provide protections that maybe we weren't as focused on in the past, because maybe in the past states and localities were more viewed as the problem as opposed to the solution. And so what are some ways that we might look at places that maybe we thought were the problem before that might now offer solutions?
That's really interesting. I mean, so that generates for me some thoughts about the ways in which, individual states, so just sort of turning to sort of legislation regarding education and sort of, I grew up in a state that will remain nameless that has recently passed some legislation limiting certain types of study, right? So we can imagine here a study related to the political and social struggles of particular groups of people, and sort of limiting those, limiting that curriculum on the grounds that it's divisive and that sort of thing. I mean, in a lot of what I hear both of you describing, I'm beginning to sort of pick up on what I might think of as kind of meta civic principles, right? So ways that we might begin thinking about, again, as Professor Levine explicitly articulated, how do we arbitrate or sort of navigate when we've got these differences in values? And Professor Banks, as you were describing sort of the different histories and circumstances that people and statuses that people have that are part of our communities, how do we engage them and engage them well, right? Recognizing that there's going to be disagreement and difference. So I guess my question here, and then I'm going to be quiet and hear from those of us in the audience, as well as those of you at home. Please do jot down your questions in the Q&A box there on Zoom. But my question here at this moment is, what guidance do you think we ought to have in thinking about some of the underlying values that ought to be driving this civic educational work? Again, there's going to be disagreement, and some of that disagreement is, bad faith sort of action. But then there are going to be some issues about which, look, the jury's out. Do we include this or not? Is this overreach? So just curious if you have any thoughts or responses to some of the values that we might want to hold in place in determining what ought to be or not be included in a civic educational curriculum.
So actually, I was just talking about this with my students this week in my seminar, which is that one of the challenges when we talk about values is that we generally can agree at the 50,000-foot level. And that we can all come up with, think about traditional American values, Myrtle. I'm thinking about, we should, information, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom, liberty. These are all things that we can all agree on. And the challenge comes when we're trying to decide what to do. In light of freedom, whose freedom? Freedom for what? What is the implication of that person's freedom on my freedom? And so I think the real challenge is maybe recognizing that these questions are the questions that we have to grapple with. And how do we acknowledge that nobody has a monopoly on freedom? And nobody has... And I think the other piece of it in this, one of the pieces that I think is really hard and why I wanted to acknowledge it in the book is recognize that these are not going to always be easy conversations, but they're not going to always be hard for the same people. And so recognizing that part of living in a democracy is that there's going to be this disagreement, and the purpose and goal in democracy is not to shut out that dissent. I mean, again, we think about America and the role that dissent has played in our founding, and yet moving forward, we often are trying to quash dissent. And so recognizing that that is a part of our society, and how do we productively engage dissent?
Yeah, I'm sure that I'm with you again. Maybe we're not being interesting because we can't disagree, but I will build on a little. I was, Richard Haass is a sort of distinguished American diplomat. I don't know a lot about international stuff, but he's famous. And he's just got a new book out about civic education, and it was first sort of floated in the Atlantic with an article. And so I want to disagree with him. So what he's saying is we all have to agree about some things, and we have to reinforce our agreement. And he uses the analogy to to American Judaism, where there's the Passover ceremony, and we have one story, and we tell it every year, and we draw certain very explicit conclusions from it. We need to do that as a people, he says. And to me, I mean, I understand the appeal of the idea that everybody would rehearse the same things that I believe every year, but I think once we spell it out at less than a 50,000 foot level, we're going to disagree. And he's barking up. What he's imagining is an end to the conversation. We need to. I know he thinks that there'll be some other conversation, but we need to get past this thing. It seems so terrible. We disagree about our country, a fundamental quality of it. And so we need to get past that, and we need to have a sort of civic ritual, mainly in K-12 schools, where we all tell ourselves this is what was true. And I just believe that the dissent is good and natural in a free and diverse country. It's natural. You know, your home state is not exemplifying that, but on the other hand, federalism is actually good because your home state can't determine my current state of Massachusetts policy. So I actually think federalism is good. And what we should expect is never to resolve the question of whether, for example, whether this country is fundamentally good or bad or somewhere in between. We're not going to solve that because we're going to be differently situated. So what we need to do is figure out how to live together productively, given that we don't agree. And so I just, pluralism is good. Because you asked about sort of underlying principles. So one way to go is the underlying principles are dissent and good dissent. And we have to figure that out. That's not easy for another reason that you alluded to, which is that what counts as free speech versus an exclusion or hurtful comment in the certain is hard. To a certain extent, I kind of want to say we're not going to articulate. Or one more thought is, when someone like Richard Haas comes along, maybe I should be more friendly, because I should just interpret it a different way, which is he's just saying what he thinks we should all learn. Fine. I mean, I can say what I think we should all learn, and the conversation will never end. I sense the specter of a kind of desire for closure, which I don't think is right. I wish it was presented more like, this is my contribution to the conversation, and I'm sure it will continue, instead of we have to get this done because we're not going to get it done. But, maybe it's okay because he'll lay out what he actually thinks is.
So I suppose I'm hearing from both of you then a sort of a resistance to conclusion and an embrace of an invitation. So we might think of the underlying principles or the underlying values as values of sort of, again, dialogical, conversational invitation. Rather than we will all say this, right? We will commit ourselves to hearing one another, right? To better understanding those who are unlike ourselves, which, of course, easier said than done, particularly in the moments we're living through. I could imagine some folks finding that to be a challenge and a profound one. Again, I do want to hear from folks here, so I will encourage folks with questions to make their way to the microphone now. Again, folks can kind of queue up at the microphone, and then we'll hear from you in the order that you are standing at the microphone. In addition, those of you at on the virtual platform, do submit your questions. We will get to those as time permits. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed both presentations. I'm from Teachers College. I'm one of the philosophy of education people. But I'm interested in sort of this ambiguity of the terms like group and community. Professor Banks used the word polity. But the question from Professor Thompson about, who are the we, I think is also, for me, what is the what that you're really talking about? So, to use the term groups, that sounds to me like itself a form of positivism, sort of like how a philosopher might use item to avoid sort of ontological commitments. But it seems to me that's sort of the problem of avoiding the ontological commitments of the phenomena we're actually talking about. So don't we really need like a rearticulation of the political as itself a phenomenon that we can talk about? And isn't that, sort of at odds with solutions to liberalism that sort of require more liberalism? So by saying that no one has monopoly on freedom, or by saying we're going to be sort of pragmatically solving problems. So how do we sort of articulate the phenomenon of the political as the sphere in which people are members of things within a liberal context?
Thank you.
I'm not sure I fully understood, but I will say, to me, I'm not talking about groups primarily as kind of ascriptive categories. That of course matters what categories we're ascribed to, things like genders and races and things. They affect also our sense of who we are. But when I'm talking about a group, I'm talking about something that is capable of deliberating and acting. And so I do think I think you can be pretty positivist about that. I mean, maybe not, but I think you can figure out whether it can have a budget and have the next meeting. And, it doesn't have to be face-to-face, obviously it can be virtual. And then, is the question partly about what foundational sort of metaphysical and moral principles we need to motivate this? Do we have to be liberals or something like that? Do we have to think of, I got a different question in a different setting just last week, though, about does this mean that only human beings count and, for example, nature doesn't count? And do we have to figure that out in advance?
What is the spirit in which being a member of something which I think you're talking about is political actually takes place? Because there's something different about solving a problem like lifting a canoe than there is for Aristotle being a member of a colloquium.
So I just want to re-articulate what you've said for those who could not hear, given the microphone. You said that there's something different about lifting a canoe with other folks as compared to perhaps engaging in some, public action, right? Yeah.
So there are differences, but I think the differences are just interesting to talk about inside of a bigger category. So, Aristotle says things about polities, and they don't apply always to moving it's a rowboat, I guess. But I just think those are the variations. So Lynn Ostrom would have a big, chart with all the different ways that groups can vary: size, centralization of control, degree of difference, and everything, and then all the different techniques you need to make them work well. And so a Greek city-state would have a row because it's a certain size and it has certain functions, and and a crew team would be just a different row. So I'm not sure there are, to use philosophical terms, I'm not sure there's an ontological difference. It's an art. This is coming at this from a kind of artisan perspective. Like how do we make things? How do we make things?
Professor Banks, did you have a follow-up there? Or?
No, I think I agree with that. Yeah.
Then we've got another question here at the microphone.
Well, thank you, everyone, both of you, for a great talk. I enjoyed it. It gave me a lot to think about. But my question starts with, yay, Ostrom, big fan. But I'm thinking about how you can scale up Ostrom kind of framework, not just to get to a bigger group, but to get to groups that have different or clusters of people who have subclusters, and the interest of one interacts with the other. Like I'm a community organizer in an unstated state with some situation, and that, like, the politics or dynamics will be different than somewhere else. But also when I am advocating for including diverse set of voices and concerns, that kind of like higher engagement, it seems like sometimes leads to bigger clusters of people who are agreeing with each other, or something like a polarized environment or polarized society that seems like we are living in. And it can make things worse for the most vulnerable members of some of these populations. You're an immigrant child, and like because of people's higher engagement with this kind of topic, you have an environment in which people are way more keen to distinguish like immigrants from non-immigrants. You are exposing that kid to hostility that probably would be at least under the surface before. Now it's like more in their face. It makes me worried sometimes that maybe we need a better model that takes into account these interactions between different levels of, grouping people together or thinking about their concerns or what they want to do or what they should do. That when we put it out of the equation, we're going to come to conclusions or prescriptions that costs the most vulnerable of us the most.
Terrific. Thank you so much for the question.
I'm going to take a minute because this is very interesting, and I'm just But go ahead. If you
Only if you really want a minute, I'll say
I do.
something. I'm very concerned about the problem of scale because some of the kind of stuff that I happen to present today sounds very small. And it sounds sort of like small is beautiful because it's all about deliberation, but the world's problems are vast. I have an idea. I'll just share it, which is that when you want to affect things at scale, you need leverage. So you need there are a lot of different forms of leverage, but an example is you get the state government to pass a law that affects everybody. Leverage is problematic because it's not reciprocal. You can't learn from the other. It's not a we. It's us affecting somebody else. Even if you're doing a good thing, giving them a right or something, they don't get a say. But I think leverage is essential. So I think you have to be willing to use leverage. Otherwise, you're not strategic. What I would like to portray is a group of people. So leverage is a metaphor, and there's a lever. So imagine instead of me by myself being stupid and weak, trying to pull the lever, I'm with a bunch of people who are relatively diverse and accountable. At one end of the leverage. And that's the best we can do, is we can be in groups that try to exercise leverage, but the groups are diverse on relevant criteria and also somewhat porous and accountable, so that the people are not only in that group. They're not just, it's not just the committee, it's people who also wear other hats. And I think that's the best we can do, because sometimes a certain kind of lefty says we're not going to use the leverage because that's bad. Yeah. That's corrupting us. And then the world goes on the way it was before. So you got to be willing to pull the lever, but you got to do it in a way that is humble. And to do that, I think you have to be in a deliberating group at one end of the pole. I know that was metaphorical and abstract, but I think we could work out what it means for real things like unions or parties or other entities that are real in the world.
So I was just thinking about this in the context of like school children, and you said, bringing things to the surface that might have otherwise been sort of subterranean, and now the most vulnerable in the classroom are sort of being confronted with things that sort of remind. So I grew up in Seattle, Washington, at a time where, on the north end of the city, where my sister and I were like the only Black kids in the school, and every January on Martin Luther King Day, they'd do the announcement and everybody would kind of turn and look at us like, this is for you. And so I am very sympathetic to this, sort of all of a sudden now you become the focus of something that you otherwise wouldn't be. And so one of the things that I do talk about in the book is that one of the things that's important when having these conversations and doing these kinds of exercise in classrooms is, and again, so this sort of maybe slightly contradicts what I said earlier about values, but thinking about the classroom having some understanding of what are the parameters on what are we committed to in undertaking these exercises? What are the values or goals that we have in mind that we agree as a collective? And sometimes you can point to school values. Sometimes schools have a school culture that says, this is something that we aspire to do, or this is something that we are, I think my son's school has something called CARES, and it's about, being caring, accountable, and, some other values like that. And trying to ground the conversation and things of that nature so that we just don't get an echoing of what kids are hearing at home and then being regurgitated in the classroom, but really trying to help them. And again, this is different ages. You can do this in different ways, but helping them try to think through, okay, if I'm committed to this value, or if I'm thinking about what we are aiming to do as this goal right here, how do we work through this exercise in a way that allows that goal to be achieved, which might lead to some surprising results for people, but I hope that it can also provide not just these knee-jerk reactions where we just get a repeat of what's happening in the broader public discourse, but I acknowledge that is possible, which is why the motivated cognition discussions are important, so that students also can understand that when they hear that other stuff from other students, what is that about? It's not always just about, so they don't always have to internalize it.
Yeah, terrific. I know that we've got some other questions here, so I do want to make space to hear those. And I'll just remind those watching remotely, do just put your questions into the Q&A box, and then we'll have those articulated in the space here for our benefit. Please.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? This is weird.
Yes.
Okay, hi. So my name's Lane. Nice to meet you. This has been very invigorating to listen to, and it's amazing what experts you both are. So I hope that this question isn't too simple. So conversations on citizenship and legal status are conversations that I don't typically engage in my classes. And speaking of my own experience, I wouldn't say many of my classmates do either. So I kind of just wanted to check in with you. Would you reiterate the language use that you both used when talking about citizens and legal status? And you both touched on that earlier, but just to kind of revisit so that I can feel like I'm saying the best things moving forward, and maybe some of my peers might use that language as well.
Sure. So I'll put on my Immigration 101 hat, because I think, and this is why I always do that in these talks, because I feel like we often don't use, the public discourse often conflates terms. And so, at least importantly for talking about legal status, there is a difference between those who have immigrant status and those who have non-immigrant status. And typically when we talk about non-citizens, the term immigrant is just used as an umbrella term to refer to all non-citizens. But when we get into rights and opportunities to participate in society, the different categories of non-citizen status become important. So immigrants, green card holders, lawful permanent residents, LPRs, are all the people who are, have permission to reside in the United States indefinitely, as long as they don't run afoul of a deportation ground. You can get a green card status by having a particular family relationship, or by having particular employment opportunities in the United States, literally like a job offer. You may have heard that I think Melania Trump had what they called a genius visa. So there is a visa for individuals who have particularly, extraordinary ability in a particular area. You could be a executive at a company, you could be a professor. There are different categories to get the green card. And then you have non-immigrant status. And those are individuals who have been granted permission to enter for a specific purpose. So this is a lot of workers at Google, the H-1B you might have heard a lot about. You might have heard about H-2A agricultural workers. Yeah. These are categories that are non-immigrant visas. And the reason that's important is because those categories of individuals do not have a direct pathway to citizenship. In order to naturalize and become a U.S. citizen, you have to be in the green card category. And you have to have had that status for 3 years if you're married to a U.S. citizen, or otherwise 5 years. So this distinction becomes important when we think about membership and citizenship and who even has access to citizenship. So if those who are like agricultural workers and other sort of lower paid workers in our, H-1B is a very clear exception to this. They are not low paid, undervalued workers in our society. But those who are in the non-immigrant category don't have a pathway to citizenship.
Thank you.
I think that's the expert answer. And the only thing I would add, though, is something that you said before, which is that in your son's school, they also talk about citizenship as belonging to the school. So there might be moments, depending on age and everything and appropriateness, to say, there's another meaning of citizenship, which means you're a great contributor. And by the way, that does not mean that you have to have any kind of legal status. And just affirming that it doesn't matter to me whether you have some kind of legal status with our government, because you're a citizen of this classroom.
And I think that can actually help in thinking about, because citizen is often used as a synonym for member. Are you a member of this community? And so I actually think that can help with students thinking about the boundaries of citizenship as a status, because if we understand citizenship to be about membership, how are the ways that our legal rules governing citizenship do not map onto our understandings of who are members of our community?
Sure, yeah. And just one thing that I'll just quickly add, just thinking about your response and sort of with your child's school. So my child attends a school that has one of these kind of citizenship kind of thing. And it's got some values built into it. Citizens of this school, we're kind and we're respectful and we're peaceful. And I always think to myself, it's an interesting thing to kind of slip peacefulness in there, right? Because as I was sharing with both of you earlier, my children are in a sort of phase of protest at the moment, which is
management.
Against management. But interesting to kind of build, into the account of citizenship that some sense of compliance, right? Some sense that things will be order will be maintained. And I could imagine, just touching back on the earlier point, creating a really interesting and dynamic, I mean, not, I don't want to give K-12 educators more to do in this regard, but you could imagine a version of things where dissent is kind of built into an account of what it means to be a citizen, even as a member of the school, right? There's space for your disagreement, and that disagreement will be heard and acknowledged in a way that might track then with some future work in the larger space. So, yeah, interesting.
And even teach them how to,
That's right.
what are the
Yeah.
what are the different ways in which you
That's right.
dissent?
That's right. Yeah. I see that we've got another question, and I think we've got time for this as perhaps our final question.
Oh, good. Well, thank you for this presentation. It's been wonderful. One of the great debates in civic education is about the role of patriotism, developing some sort of sentimental attachment. And some people say, that sort of love and care for the community is actually essential to asking the practical question, what should we do? We have to care about the community. Does patriotism or some sort of sentimental attachment to one's political community, does that play any role in your notions of civic education, especially for undocumented immigrants or something like that?
Yeah.
So the reason I'm hesitating, because this is a complicated one for me, because I'm not sure that you have to have the sentimental, gooey, lovey-dovey rainbow feelings about this nation state. Well, I don't like the term nation state, but the political entity that you are connected to, as much as you need to have a commitment to the place in which you are living. And I think that commitment to, I want this place where I live to be the best place for as many people as possible, and that is what I'm committed to. And I'm committed to I'm committed to enacting that here in this place. Might be enough.
That sounds good. I was part of this, sort of continue to be part of this thing called the Educating for American Democracy, which is a group that wrote a bunch of, in a way, an answer to your question earlier about what's the core that everybody should agree to. Although one of the ways we finessed that, and I think this was the principal thing to do, was to turn a lot of these into questions rather than answers, and to say that people should be thinking about these questions.
Sure.
But there were some underlying principles, and one of them was a question about patriotism, and there was ideological diversity in the group, and I think it's no secret that the conservatives really wanted to have some patriotism in there, and some of the more progressive people really didn't. And we landed on reflective patriotism, which we talk about in some detail. And I think everybody, there are different levels of enthusiasm for that, but there was certainly sign-off, including by me. So the reflective gets you to asking, it gets rid of the gooiness. It's about let's figure out what this place is and what's good and bad about what it's been so far. But the patriotism is the concern for it, and so I'm okay with that. But again, I'm not so happy with a constant return to the one community, which is this very, very large one, the United States, instead of the city of Columbus. I mean, why can't you really care about that? Is at least as much.
Yeah.
I like that idea of thinking about it as concern for the place.
Yeah. So interesting. So I'm hearing then perhaps some statement or some ambivalence about the sort of emotional connection, but sort of centering here on concern as commitment to. I earlier said that would be our last question. I was wrong, because I do want to make sure that we've got time for this question. And if we don't have enough time to answer it, we can still hold the question as one that we'll take with us as we exit. So please do pose your question.
I appreciate that. I'll be brief. So in the interest of time, I'll try to be as blunt as possible. So I want to ask about what you think of as the limits of civic education. And you've already mentioned a couple of the obstacles in the way. For example, some of the obvious contradictions involved in using a state institution to sort of challenge the legitimacy of state structures, and to add on to that, some of the sort of blue-red polarization that places limits to the kind of Overton window of what valid political speech is in a given moment and region. So put in the most sort of naive way possible, does civic education have a role in opposing ICE? Can we name some of the horrors of our time, and does civic education have the political leverage to address those head on? And if not, then how do you reconcile that? How do you think about that in your own work?
Thanks so much. Yeah. So I maybe in a sentence or two, just to kind of tease for the next books that you'll both write.
So I think it can. And I think this depends on, this is hard work for teachers. We're asking teachers to carry a heavy burden here, especially in communities where they can become targets. And so I think, again, it's thinking about those commitments and those value. And again, going back to those questions that we're asking students to think about, and those questions may lead them to say, and I believe you said ICE, right? Those questions may lead them to say, I don't look at ICE playing the same role in our society as I may have initially thought before I asked those questions.
Yeah, I think that's right. This may not satisfy you. That's fine. We don't have enough time to talk about it in plenary, but we could talk about it later. But I think the school can be a place where these issues come up and where a lot of voices get heard and where the students get empowered to speak. I don't think the teacher can take on the role of being against ICE. I mean, I just don't think that's realistic, and I'm not even sure I'm in favor of it.
Well, thank you to both Professor Levine, Professor Banks. This was a wonderful event and a wonderful opportunity to engage with your work and to engage with one another. So I'd also like to thank all of the attendees here in person and via the virtual platform. This has been wonderful, and I'm happy to say this is not the end. There is more coming from the Center for Ethics and Human Values. I encourage you to visit our website, take a look at upcoming events. We look forward to being in conversation with you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.